You're listening to the Bloom Europa podcast, a project that privileges new and independent thinking on Europe while discussing its current challenges. In each episode, we take a holistic but hard-hitting approach to analysing pan-European affairs.
Hello and welcome to the Bloom Europa podcast. I'm Carlos Montenegro, co-founder of Bloom Europa, coming to you from Lisbon and Boston. And today, I wanted to share the first episode of our new podcast, where we will talk about how imminent may be a Russian invasion of Ukraine, as one country after another country are advising its citizens to evacuate Ukraine. Today's our guest is Mariana Budjeryn, a research associate with the project on managing the atom at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, Belfer Center. She's also the author of the upcoming book, Inheriting the Bomb, Soviet Collapse and Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine, published by Johns Hopkins Press. Our first episode will be hosted by my good friend, Adérito Vicente, PhD researcher at the European University Institute and also co-founder of Bloom Europa. They will both help us to assess how dangerous may be the current crisis. Welcome both.
Thank you, Carlos, for this introduction, and thank you, Mariana, for joining us. We are very pleased to have you here.
It's my pleasure.
So, Mariana, let us start our conversation about your research work. You have written various publications about the event called the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. What you can tell us about this political agreement?
So, to put this Budapest Memorandum into context, I will backtrack a little bit and start with a broader picture. So as we all know, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Soviet Union was a nuclear superpower. At that time, it had about 30,000 nuclear weapons on its territory. And overnight, because the Soviet Union collapsed into 15 constitutive states that used to be its republics, 4 of those republics, now newly independent states, inherited the nuclear arms that were once Soviet. And those 4 were Russia, of course, but also Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. So essentially overnight, Ukraine became the home for the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal. And Kazakhstan, incidentally, was home to the world's 4th largest nuclear arsenal. So this is the scale of nuclear armaments that was inherited by these newly independent states. And while Belarus proceeded, so the expectation of the international community and the United States in particular was that only one nuclear successor should emerge from the Soviet collapse. And that was done because, nuclear non-proliferation was a policy priority for the United States, and also fears of regional instability and such. And that, was logical that Russia would be that sole nuclear successor, especially in the context of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. Right? The NPT recognizes only 5 nuclear states. One of them collapsed, but you couldn't very well admit 4 instead of that one. There could be only one successor. And so, Russia succeeded the Soviet Union in respect of the NPT. But then the question of what to do, whose weapons essentially were located and deployed on the territory of the other 3 became a matter of contestation. And Belarus proceeded quite easily. It had no claim to these weapons. It sort of put them under Russian jurisdiction and then proceeded to disarm After a short hesitation, a contestation, so did Kazakhstan. But Ukraine became this case of where its leaders contested Russia's monopoly, as it were, on this nuclear succession, the Soviet nuclear succession. They said, these are our weapons. And even though Ukraine had a formulated policy that it would become a non-nuclear state, so it would relinquish nuclear weapons ultimately, it wanted a deal. And part of the deal was a compensation for the fissile material that was contained in the Ukrainian warheads. And another part was security guarantees, or at least that's what Ukraine wanted to obtain. So these security guarantees, certainly it was predicated by the fact that Russia was emerging, even back then in early 1990s, as a potential threat to Ukraine, as a country that will potentially try to curb Ukraine's sovereignty, that might revise Ukrainian borders. And Ukrainians were worried about that in retrospect, all too justifiably. So they started in mid-1992, Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ukrainian diplomats started to negotiate these security guarantees. And the end of that process, sort of the result of that process, was a Budapest, it's officially called the Memorandum on Security Assurances in connection with Ukraine's accession to the NPT. So as we see in the title of this memorandum, there is no word guarantee, there's a word assurances, and this is very significant, and I'd be happy to explain in what ways. But this is essentially a document that was signed by Ukraine and the three NPT depository states, United States, United Kingdom, and Russia. And it pledged security commitments to Ukraine to respect its sovereignty, territorial integrity, the inviolability of its borders, abstention from threat and use of force, economic coercion, but also it contained nuclear-related assurances, so NPT-related assurances that all nuclear states pledged to NPT non-nuclear states, to the so-called positive and negative security assurances. So not to threaten this non-nuclear country with nuclear weapons, and should this country come under the threat of nuclear weapons, to seek action at UN Security Council. So this is essentially what the Budapest Memorandum amounted to.
Yes, thank you, indeed. So in a way, this memorandum was a critical juncture on all this Russia-Ukraine crisis that we have now. We also can see that there are roots of the current crisis that came from the breakout of the Soviet Union as well. Actually in the period in which this political agreement was made. My question is, which major events came after the 1994 Budapest Memorandum?
Right. So you're correct in saying that the signature of the Budapest Memorandum was very significant for Ukrainians. It was, even though they did not obtain the guarantees that they sought, something really robust and maybe something that specified costs for the breach of it, right? The memorandum contained none of that. It simply reaffirmed security commitments contained elsewhere, say in the UN Charter or the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, and as I said, the NPT-related nuclear security assurances. And still, it was a significant document that recognized Ukraine's legitimate security concerns, and Ukraine became the only country to join the NPT with such a signed document attached to the act of accession, if you will. Belarus and Kazakhstan also signed similar memoranda simply because they were sort of fellow travelers in this whole story, but Ukraine actually negotiated it insisted that there should be something like this memorandum, and got it signed. And after the signature, Ukrainian diplomats and the leaders at the time, they understood very well what they got and what they didn't get. They knew that those weren't robust security assurances, something like NATO Article 5 type of commitment that perhaps Ukrainians would have liked to have. But they still translated the word assurances as guarantees into Ukrainian and into Russian, incidentally, partially justifying it by the fact that there isn't an equivalent for the word assurance in Ukrainian, which is only partly right, but also sort of to sell this document to their internal audiences that were quite worried then that perhaps Ukrainians weren't getting the kinds of security settlement that they wanted. And after the signature of the memorandum, there seems to have been sort of a complacency, as it were, that, we got these guarantees in exchange for a disarmament, so things are good. We don't have to worry much about things. And of course, the emphasis or the focus of Ukraine's development at that point shifted very squarely onto economic development, the establishment of independent currency. This was the presidency of Leonid Kuchma, who was, for all his other faults, was someone who put a stop to this really spiraling inflation and the real very deep post-Soviet transitional crisis. So Ukraine sort of wanted to develop economically and remain generally at this neutral, non-allied country. But very slowly, it sort of appeared that perhaps Ukraine was suffering from the general malaise that afflicted all post-Soviet countries, where there was a small number of people that got very rich very quickly, the so-called oligarchs, by acquiring state property at very low prices, and so they kind of grabbed power and became intertwined with the political institutions. And one thing that Ukraine has, as it turned out, always had was this nascent but very vocal and robust civil society. So whenever some of these most egregious excesses of political leaders became apparent, people just came out and protested. And one of the first such protests was a movement of Ukraine against Kuchma that was spurred by the murder of a very well-known Ukrainian oppositional journalist, Georgy Gangadze. His body was found beheaded in the woods outside of Kyiv. That was early 2000s, and that spurred an outcry. Kuchma tried to anoint his other, a president, Viktor Yanukovych, as his anointed heir to the presidential throne. Somehow this person won. There were allegations of widespread fraud, and that spurred election fraud. That spurred the Orange Revolution in 2004. So this was the first big kind of mass movement where people came out and said, our voice needs to count properly, and we're not going to settle and be manipulated by politicians in the office. And it was a successful revolution. The election was rerun. The opposite number, or the contender in the presidential elections to Viktor Yanukovych, Viktor Yushchenko, won and had a 5-year presidency. Then, as we well know, after that presidency, the original Viktor Yanukovych won and became, very closely aligned with Kremlin. In fact, Ukrainian security and military establishments took a very big hit at that point. At some point, Ukraine's defense minister was a Russian citizen. So you can imagine, the level to which Russian interests had penetrated Ukraine's establishment. And once again, there was another protest, this time in 2014, spurred by the refusal of this President Viktor Yanukovych, under Russian pressure, to sign an association agreement with the European Union. He, last minute, he decided not to sign. There was, years of preparation that went into it. Under Russian pressure, he rescinded on that decision, and people went out and protested. Now, as opposed to the Orange Revolution, in this what became known as Revolution of Dignity, the government of Viktor Yanukovych used force. And that was a huge mistake, because his regime would have probably survived the protests had he not sent riot police that brutally tried to squash it, and that only made people more angry and more people came out. So these particular protests turned violent and turned bloody. There were about 100 people that died in late January, early February of 2014. And President fled to Russia, President Yanukovych, and amid this upheaval, that's when Kremlin moved in and occupied Crimea. This was done in a very well-planned and very well-prepared special operation. This was done without a shot. And at the same time, they started instigating, takeover of towns and administrative buildings in Ukraine's east, where they thought there would be support for such thing. There, they miscalculated, because at that point Ukrainians sort of regrouped and managed to stage a resistance. So we know the story. Since then, there has been a war in eastern Ukraine for 8 years now. It was hot and bloody for the first couple of years, and then a ceasefire essentially was reached with the participation of Russia, Germany, and France. That was negotiated in 2015. And now we see sort of another spur in that process, right? Again, instigated on the Russian side, seemingly out of thin air, right? Just a year ago, any one of us would not have predicted that we would be standing on a brink of war, literally. This day, February 17th, 2022.
Yes, indeed. So, from your perspective as a scholar, but also as an Ukrainian, why do you think Russia is threatening Ukraine now?
Terito, that's a very good question. And I think, there has been a lot of guesswork and a lot of punditry in the last month or two about motives and about timing. Why now? Why start all of this now? I don't have a good answer to it, but the best one I've heard, and the best one I can wrap my head around, is that over since 2014, right, when Ukrainian army was in pretty sorry state, it wasn't very well developed and wasn't very well supplied. Since then, Ukrainian armed forces had made great progress due to Ukrainian government's efforts and due to the Western security and military help from the United States, but also from other partners, from Canada, from the UK, from Poland, etc. So there's the cost of invading and occupying at least parts of Ukraine has gone up. And if it continues that way, then perhaps it will at some point become prohibitive. So Russia will no longer have sort of a plausible military option in Ukraine. At the same time, the calculation was that after Afghanistan and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the United States would be less likely to stand up for Ukraine or get involved in some other, potential conflict in Europe, whether Putin was banking on the disunity of NATO and the West on the question of Ukraine, because, of course, Ukraine is not a particularly essential country, or hasn't been until now, for most of European countries and for most of, the Nord Stream 2 is nearly finished, and of course, there was probably a gamble that Germany would not risk put that project in peril just over Ukraine. If that has been the calculation, it has backfired. This has not happened, right? But I think from Russia's standpoint, there was sort of the stalemate where Donbass was largely quiet, where Russia has been, they had Crimea, but, it takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of resources for them to maintain that and supply it over the bridge and so forth. So if they were to make this move and change the status quo, now was probably the window of opportunity, with maybe a weakened and disunited West, and then a Ukraine that was still weak enough to be able to, to be conquered, or at least parts of it to be conquered. Because, there's news of Turkey supplying drones, combat drones to Ukraine, even starting production of these drones in Ukraine. There's supply of arms. So, there's a buildup of Ukrainian defense capacity. And if that had continued, I think that would have removed the military option for Putin altogether.
So in recent months, we have distinct positions by the US and Russia. On last December, Russia presented the US and NATO with a list of demands. Actually, Putin demanded that NATO stop its eastward expansion and deny membership to Ukraine, and NATO should roll back troop deployment in countries that joined after 1997. Of course, as expected, the US and NATO rejected those demands and proposed in return some proposal for agreement on arms control, mostly around missiles and nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads. So in that sense, why do you think diplomacy hasn't produced enough breakthroughs so far?
Well, so the arms control part of it, that was launched or relaunched, as it were, as after the Geneva summit in June. It was, if I'm correct, last year, between Biden and Putin, and there already, working groups have been set up, an agenda has been drawn up for potential talks on arms control. So you really don't need to build up 150,000 troops on Ukrainian border to start talking arms control. That was already proceeding. There was a meeting in September, and then again, I think maybe in October and November. So there have been, and now in January, that was already the meeting that had addressed some of the Russian demands on arms control. And, arms control is is an ongoing process. It has been the staple of US-Soviet relations, and there have been agreements between Russia and the US after the Soviet collapse. So that's a perfectly fine and productive way for the two nuclear powers to engage. In fact, they should engage in arms control. It's better for all of us. Now, the Russian demands about the non-expansion of NATO and the rollback of forces, I find it hard to believe that President Putin did not understand that that's a non-starter. That, if he wanted really de facto to prevent Ukraine's membership in NATO, he has already done that essentially by occupying part of Ukraine and making it a volatile region with contested borders, something NATO would not likely to absorb, certainly not anytime soon, and certainly not in any foreseeable future. I mean, he's already had de facto veto on Ukraine's membership in NATO. I think perhaps what he didn't like seeing was that even despite the absence of this membership in NATO, Ukraine was getting the military aid, and Ukraine was improving its armed forces, and Ukraine was getting arms supplied to bolster its defenses. And most certainly after 2014, even the parts of the population that were traditionally very friendly towards Russia, I mean, there's whole cities and huge parts of Ukraine that are essentially Russian speaking. And there have been intermarriages, and people have relatives across the border. So even in those parts, though, his strategy had backfired, and there's a lot more kind of readiness or sentiment that Russia is the actual aggressor and that Russia is a threat, even amongst these previously friendly parts of the population. So I think he was kind of losing Ukraine permanently to the West. And that is somehow, I'm not sure why he's so fixated on Ukraine. I really don't know, because if you read his sayings and his articles, and especially this one in June, was it, or in July, about Ukraine and Russia being same people. And then there was an October article by ex-president Medvedev, who's a good guy, the West likes Medvedev because he was sort of reasonable, and he signed a new start with the US. But it was just like scathing disdain, this really patronizing way of speaking about Ukrainians as kind of these non-people, as this accidental state that doesn't even deserve, sovereignty. They're just kind of like a bunch of jokers who don't know who they are. And it's just really a really striking language that just kind of belittles and diminishes Ukraine as as a state, as a project, as a people who have some kind of right to, to independence and sovereignty. So I find it hard to believe that somehow it's some kind of great love for or concern for Ukraine that is driving him in his policy. If anything, it's probably the opposite.
Right. So, as you know it, recently there was a proposal by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, by its chairman in office, the Polish Zbigniew Rau, basically proposed to launch a renewed informal dialogue on security in Europe within the framework of this international organization. The answer from Russia was positive, but of course the security guarantees that Moscow wants can be only solved by the US and NATO. In that context, do you think was a good proposal, or it could be another venue for diplomacy?
So, OSCE should certainly be a venue for many things, including strategies for de-escalation. There's a Vienna document on military exercises and different buildup of military forces that needs updating. And Ukraine actually has activated the mechanism of consultations, or called a meeting under the Vienna document, to address this Russian troops buildup. So these are exactly the kinds of confidence building measures and transparency measures that already exist within the OSCE. The challenge is to apply them and to use them and to respect them and abide by them and keep on improving them. The demand for the guarantee that NATO would not expand, the striking thing about it was not only because politically somehow politically Putin should have known that's a non-starter, right? So there is, of course, a strategy of starting high in negotiations with the view that you will have to climb down, to sort of this middle ground that would still be acceptable for you. But that really sounded something like an ultimatum. But it's the time frame that was most striking. They wanted an answer within 2 weeks somehow, or a pledge. Now, we know that NATO is an alliance. It's not an entity that enters into any kind of international agreements and gives pledges. It's the member states, right? So the process for 29 member states to go and deliberate that policy, because unilaterally you can't do it. This, I think, Article 8 of the Washington Treaty that founded NATO, that says, no state can unilaterally undertake, no, signatory of this agreement can unilaterally undertake obligations that are in conflict. I paraphrase, but essentially in conflict with this agreement. And Article 10, of course, following up, says there's an open door policy. NATO has the right to invite members, or any European country has the right to seek NATO membership. So essentially, you would have to agree to unilaterally to change, or collectively, rather, to change or make caveats to this Article 10. And NATO as an alliance can't do it. So that would involve even procedurally, 29 members deliberating and deciding that, in their parliaments or whatever their constitutional procedures are. I mean, that would take, even if there were political will, that would take longer than 2 weeks, methinks, right?
Right.
So that's why it seems that it very strongly suggests itself that this demand for guarantees was a non-starter, and it does sound like an ultimatum. I mean, perhaps there could be, a political pledge to maybe suspend invitation for, another 10 years or so. I mean, I don't know, but given how high Putin started, that would hardly seem like a victory for him in his domestic, for his domestic audiences. Even if that were true, which clearly NATO has no intention of changing its open door policy, as we've learned.
Right. In that context, if I may add, some days ago, former Finnish Prime Minister and current director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute, my institute, Alexander Stubb, told recently to Amanpour in CNN that Finland's position within Soviet Union, that is, Finlandization, is a sore point in his country's history, and of course doesn't apply to Ukraine. So this is his opinion. So in other words, what he's trying to say is that it wouldn't be a good solution because essentially the history of Finland and Soviet Union/Russia is different from the history between Ukraine and Russia.
Of course, yeah, and also, but I mean, the concept of neutrality or guaranteed neutrality, it's not, perhaps it could travel across times and contexts and geographical contexts. It's just, it seems to me that it's already too little too late at this point. Already after the war has been on for 8 years, already after this act of build up and the spike in tensions that we see now, and the really looming threat. I mean, I think this morning I for the first time I kind of lost my optimism that war could be avoided. It's really not looking good, and there's no good reason for it other than Putin wants this war, it seems to me, right? So a guaranteed neutrality at this point, I really don't think would work.
Yes, just to finish, as you said earlier, considering the current situation, perhaps an invasion could happen. You even mentioned the word war, and it's a narrative that is out there. But what do you think is going to happen?
Darito, that's $1 million question, and I wish it was just $1 million question. That's probably, hundreds and thousands of lives kind of question. It certainly looks like Russia has prepared, and it continues to prepare a military option. Whether they decided to use it, to move on in it already, and this is just, kind of these little steps that they're doing to kind of get there, there's no way of knowing. I think if there is a military action, it's not going to be a full-blown, large-scale invasion like the media has been portraying it, where, you have, huge masses of tanks and people rolling through the Ukrainian border and going straight for Kyiv. I mean, I hope not. That might happen, but I think that would be too risky and risk, Russians stretching too thin and, having to contend with local resistance along a stretched line. So that does not seem as plausible, but I certainly can see how from the occupied parts of the Donbass, there would be growing escalation. So the breach of the Minsk agreement, so we've already seen it this morning, there has been a spike in ceasefire breaches with the use of the kinds of artillery and grenade launchers that are banned under the Minsk agreements. So there has been 29 shellings just this morning, and one of them hit a kindergarten. Actually, fortunately, nobody, there were no casualties, or at least nobody was killed. But so, you would see this kind of gradual escalation in the Donbass, and perhaps there would be, a move or an invasion from right above it, so to the north of the occupied Donbass, and from the south, from the Azov Sea, to perhaps join that Donbass region with Crimea, to kind of create a land corridor between Crimea and mainland Russia and the Donbass. I can, the revival of this Novorossiya, the New Russia project that has been foiled back in 2014, 2015. And, this could be false flag operations. There's gazillion tools that Russians and their special ops have at their disposal. They control the media. They have been flooding the internal media market with all sorts of, what we call fake news, very, very powerful propaganda campaign right now in Russia. You've probably heard that in the press conference with Chancellor Scholz, Putin mentioned the word genocide. I hope Scholz cringed because, of course, certainly one doesn't throw these words around lightly, and especially in front of a German. And there's sort of a different world, it seems, that the Russian society lives in, different information kind of environment. So who the heck knows what could be justified internally and what could be sold to the internal audiences. But there could be a pretext of some kind of attack on Russian-speaking population or Russian citizens, because of course we know Russians have been giving out passports in the Donbass. Allegedly, there are about 600 Russian passport holders in the Donbass. I mean, there's many different ways in which you can justify the start of a conflict, if a conflict is what you want.
So, Mariana, in that note, we hope that, paraphrasing U.S. former Ambassador Alison Stevenson, we hope that cool heads will prevail. And of course, again, thank you so much for coming to our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We kindly invite you to subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, YouTube, and other platforms. You can also check out all the links and resources on the show's notes. That's all for this episode, folks, and we look forward to you tuning in next time. This was a Bloom Europa original.